Hi, everyone. This is Anna Sophia Alcaraz from the Center for Global Education. Thank you for tuning in today, whether you're watching from YouTube or your phone. We are going to be having our first CGE Talks, and we're very lucky to have a very special presenter here today, Mariah Allen. You've probably seen her around campus, class of 2020, so congratulations on that. And she's a double major in econ and sociology with a minor in Spanish. And Mariah's been really involved with our office. She did a semester abroad in Peru, summer semester in Costa Rica, global classroom in Cuba, and apart from that, she's written blogs for our office. She's been very active on campus, and she's going to be talking a bit more about her experiences today. In her talk, A Different Kind of Out of Place. So if you have any questions, please let us know. We'll be happy to answer them post presentation. So over to you, Mariah.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Anna Sophia. Like Anna Sophia was saying, I have traveled to 3 different locations during my college career, and I loved every single minute of it. The reason I wanted to have this talk, because our office at Marymount University really focuses on sending a diverse group of students abroad. And so I think it's really important to talk about being diverse and being abroad. So I'm just going to jump right in and show some pictures specifically from my time in Peru and talk about being a minority abroad. So we all know that studying abroad is an exciting experience that affords invaluable skills to the traveler, but not everyone experiences study abroad the same way. At Marymount, the Study Abroad office works very hard to allow anyone who wants to study abroad to go abroad. This means that a diverse group of students from our already diverse university are able to go to a variety of countries. This doesn't necessarily hold true for other universities. Studying abroad is not an opportunity that is accessible for most college students. And this is evident when you actually are in country. For example, I was the only Black student in my semester-long program abroad in Peru. And this had an effect on me in ways that I definitely was not prepared for. Being a Black woman in America alone has a lot of connotations that come with it. And when traveling or meeting other Americans in a different country, those connotations that I desperately wanted to leave behind definitely followed me. I was confronted with, and in general, like when you're in country, you're confronted with stereotypical white study abroad students that are in your program. And while they're not necessarily insensitive enough to talk about your race or your ethnicity in front of you, they are insensitive enough to talk about those in your host country. Usually it's not anything malicious, but rather more white savior rhetoric about how they want to come back to the country to help people. And they just make me feel so grateful for everything that I have. The problem lies in these statements like these because it completely ignores the humanity of those citizens who live in country, and instead it makes them an object of your privilege. And many times those who do say these statements have absolutely no qualifications to actually help in the way they think they can. There's a lack of political, societal, and economic knowledge to truly understand the dynamics within the country. And while the shift of outward racism may not be on you, others in your study abroad group may ask you questions about your culture or some aspect of your race. For example, I remember walking to the mall with my roommate who I lived with when I was studying abroad in Peru, and she specifically asked me awkward questions about my hair that were kind of microaggressions at the same time, like, do you do anything with your hair? Or the weird stares I got when we were at home and I would brush my hair, do, any of the daily Black girl things that happen. And so just like in America, race is never talked about, but it seems to always be the butt end of every joke. It feels like, that's what I mean, it feels like being out of place while being out of place physically and socially. There are more subtle things that you notice when you're abroad as well that you didn't expect that follow you out of the country, like economic disparities. For example, when sitting down to plan your solo trips, I realized that my other friends in my study abroad group who were had way more resources to do more traveling and more adventuring than I did, and other minorities that were in my group. And I personally remember trying to explain that like we're saving for larger trips, and she just simply could not understand that we couldn't just ask our parents or families for money in that situation. Not only when you're learning about inequality in your host country, but living out these inequalities in your own country miles away. In addition to facing these difficulties with your own study abroad group, soon after arriving in country, you realize that prejudice against Black and Brown folks is a global phenomenon. When in Peru, I constantly got stared at while walking down the street and heard comments about my race pretty often. And when I would stand outside my house, when I ordered Uber Eats or would wait for my friends, I would get asked if I was waiting for someone or needed to speak to someone in the house when I barely clearly lived there, like keys in hand, like walking into the house. So, and seeing the way that my other study abroad uh, members from my other study abroad groups got treated, it just never allowed me to forget that I was Black. This holds true when I'm in the United States as well. I think at the same time, I didn't realize how much being the only Black girl in my study abroad group affected the experience. There wasn't really anyone to talk to about these incidences with, which had an effect as well. While white people seem to offer pity and sometimes even POCs cannot understand the full effects of what you're going through, it's hard to have a conversation with other people that were in country with me. Sometimes like I just needed someone to say, I know, or I experienced the same thing, just some sort of validation. This is a type of loneliness that no pre-departure meeting can really prepare you for. There is a sense of community and comfortability in being surrounded by people of your own race and not having to explain aspects of yourself or feel the need to fight against stereotypes. Black Americans have a unique experience all in the world. While in the US, we constantly have to fight for the right to be who we are without prejudice. When we travel to other countries, it feels as though we are even more out of place. Sometimes traveling abroad means moving further away from finding acceptance, because while others have the privilege to be American, you're also Black and American, and don't get to choose what people see about you first.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, Mariah. We really appreciate that. Do you want to tell us a bit about the photos before we go on to some of the questions that we received?
Yeah, definitely. So the first start of the photos were a lot of experience that I had near my house, which was really cool. There were a lot of cool cities. And the picture that I'm specifically showing right here is in the major attraction of Peru, I think, is Machu Picchu. And so I had the opportunity to go travel there, which was absolutely awesome. And yeah, there were some other pictures in there from the Nazca lines that I went to. So I definitely hit some really good spots in Peru.
You mentioned that some of your classmates were traveling every weekend. So
Yeah.
did they not travel with you? They go cross country internationally while they were abroad, and you mostly stayed in country then?
Yeah, I personally stayed in country, and well, like, so we traveled. ISA the provider that I traveled with did a lot of trips that were included in our study abroad fee, but then we personally went, like me and two other students in my program did a week of traveling by ourselves. And so that was like completely planning on our own. And while like some students actually went with us on the first half of that, and then did their own thing and like traveled on the weekends on top of that. So there was definitely a lot of different pieces and parts to the traveling aspect.
Okay. Wait, can you show us can you go back to some of the photos?
Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned
Uh,
Nazca lines then, and
yeah. Oh, so this is a picture in Arequipa, which is really cool. We got to stand on top of a building and take some pictures. It was actually a restaurant, and right here is a church that has some really cool history. So these are the Nazca lines. I'm not really sure if you could see the picture, but like we went on a helicopter to see the Nazca lines from above because you can't see them. The closer you are to the ground, the less you can see them because they're so big. And so right here is the monkey, and I think we saw about 10, 15 different Nazca lines that were drawn in the sand there. And this was at Hacienda. So we did like a lot of cultural, like there was a cultural aspect. So we had dinner and there was a lot of singing and dancing. And so basically there was this is like a big slave house for lack of better terms, and like so we saw the tunnel, like slave tunnels and different things at this house. And this was a fun part. So first we went here to Ica and Paracas, which is kind of an oasis in the middle of Peru. So around it is a desert. And then the further in you get, they call it like the poor man's Galapagos Island. So you get to see tons of different animals, and it was tons of birds. There were millions and millions of birds there. We got to go on a boat and sort of get into the ocean, see all the cool animals. And this was so Peru has a variety of different geography and climates. And so another one that we got to visit was the rainforest. So I got to see some cool animals too.
great. Well, I know you talked about a very difficult subject at times, very close to heart, obviously. So one of the questions we received was, what are some coping strategies you used when confronted with microaggressions abroad?
Yeah, definitely. I kind of use the same method of like when I have microaggressions here in the United States. I think whenever you ask someone why they're asking you that question, or simply saying like, "What do you mean?" Makes them reevaluate sort of what they're asking you, what place that their question is coming from. And I think also having a good support system and FaceTiming, Skyping, emailing, texting all my friends from back at home. And while they were not necessarily in the same experience, they could understand what a microaggression was and how I felt during that time.
That's good to know. So you'd recommend having like a support system and kind of questioning the motives behind someone when confronted with some microaggressions, or at least that's what the method that you used. Yes, then?
Yeah, definitely. And there are definitely moments where there's a microaggression, and I feel like it's your right, as a person of color, to just be like, I'm not going to dignify that with a response. Like, I don't have to answer your questions too.
Um, how were your experiences with racism or discrimination or microaggressions different than in the US? Did you often have to educate others while abroad about race or some of these comments?
Yeah, and I think I tried to hit on this too. So like when you're abroad, it's two different aspects. So I'm talking about race within my study abroad group with actual Americans, and there are tons of conversation. Race is a huge topic in America, especially I think right now. So I was having those conversations that we were usually have in America with students of my group, but I feel like also it was more of the racism that's very like blatant There was like one time when we were traveling and like I just went to get some food and the guy like at the restaurant asked to touch my hair, and some like weird instances like that. So it's just, I think in America, racism, depending on where you go and who you're around, racism is more of this passive aggressive microaggression, um, like prejudice, discrimination, as opposed to what I experienced. I think in Peru specifically, in the interactions I had, it was more of just coming from a place of not knowing, of just like, I don't want to use the word ignorance because I think that's so strong, but just like not knowing and being like, oh, this is this new thing that I haven't seen before, and like borderline like fetishizing it sort of situation.
And in those situations, particularly outside of your US groups, did you have to educate others? Like you mentioned, I know for a fact that you took some classes with some Peruvian students too, right? So did you
Yeah.
have to educate others in situations like that?
I think like understanding race is the same, and understanding social issues in general. My experience was, it was kind of the same in America. Like the younger generation kind of knew what was up and kind of understood. They may have not understood fully, but they had an awareness where I didn't have to educate like students in my university. It was just like those weird interactions that I had with like older Peruvians or like guys yelling down the street. And I feel like in those incidences, you just kind of ignore and not necessarily try to educate someone in that scenario. You just like kind of try to ignore it, keep your head down.
Sure. Um, did your experiences vary from place to place within Peru? You mentioned that you traveled quite a bit within the country, or at least to a few different places. Did you find that your experiences changed in every place, or did you face similar situations all around Peru?
Yeah, I think that's actually an amazing question. I think at my where I was staying in Peru, it was a wealthier area of Peru. Everyone knows Lima, Peru. It's the capital. So it wasn't, and by the time that I was there for like a month or a few weeks, people had already seen me. They already knew me. Like a lot of the crossing guards, like a lot of the guards at the school, like, you know, the neighbors down the street. So I already knew them. So it wasn't that much of a, like maybe one or two experiences, or like I would definitely get stared at when I walked down the street, but nobody would say anything. I think when I traveled, because a lot of Peru, like I did a lot of hiking and a lot of cities that weren't necessarily as wealthy, because there's like huge inequality in Peru. There was definitely more of those incidences of like, oh, can I touch your hair? Oh, can I do, like, what is this, what is that, like just saying more, they're like more forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And we know that you've traveled internationally to a few other places with our office. What about compared to Costa Rica or to Cuba? How was this different?
Yeah, definitely. So in Costa Rica, I feel as though um I was around Americans more and more often. So I think that race was the same dynamics that it was in the United States when I was in Costa Rica. Um, and I feel as though it was a little more white saviory in Costa Rica, if that makes sense, because I feel like we were not as connected to the students and just to Costa Ricans in general. But when I was in Cuba, I think Cuba is really interesting because Cuba, a lot of the Cuban people were saying, "Oh, there's no such thing as racism. We don't care about race in Cuba." So there were just little things that you would see, like, that's not okay, but I'm not gonna say anything. And I think it definitely was a different experience because I was with, it was traveling for a week with a class. And so I was definitely around people I had conversations with before. So yeah, but with the Cuban people, it's definitely, they didn't think racism existed in their country.
Okay. Um, yeah, and I remember because I went with you all on that program
Yeah.
that Cuba is definitely a very, very diverse country too. So uh,
Oh yeah.
you all had a presentation on race there, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. Um, but yeah, I think Cuba is an incredibly diverse country, and I do think that it was, so when I was in Peru, you could definitely, there were not, I remember seeing like one or two Peruvians that were my skin color or darker. But in Cuba, I feel like there was a diverse group of people um, that I was able, to connect with and be like, oh, okay, this is a society that they live in. And it's not as divided as I feel like my experience with Peru, what I saw.
You felt, as the name says in your title, more out of place in that sense then.
Yeah, yeah.
What advice would you give students, faculty, staff who want to be better allies for minority students while they're abroad or preparing to go abroad, or if they encounter these situations? I know that's a very loaded question.
No, definitely. And I think the best approach for students, well, first, I think I want to say this should definitely not deter you from wanting to study abroad. I think study abroad was an experience that helped me figure out more about who I am, what my interests are, and I think it was just an incredible learning experience. And so, answering your question, I think it is the responsibility of the faculty, of professors, to sort of foster that experience and make sure students are getting as much from the experience as possible. And I think part of that is actually for the professors and for the staff that are going on the trip to educate themselves about maybe not just race, but how sexuality is viewed in these countries before they go. What are the social issues in these countries, and sort of educating themselves, and sort of talking about that to the class, maybe not necessarily singling out every minority in your class, but being like, hey, this is what is happening in this country, and I just want you guys to go in knowing what's going on and the dynamics that are taking place, and what you might experience.
And for students who want to be better allies when they are confronted with situations of microaggressions to other classmates or friends or anything.
Yeah, definitely. And I could speak from my personal experience. Like, if I had a friend who definitely just stepped into that situation and been, more supportive and saying like, oh, that's not something that you should ask. That's not something you should say. Because I guarantee you that, especially a lot of Black people out of POC get the same questions over and over and over again, and it kind of gets exhausting. So you are out like just taking the weight like off your friend's shoulders and sort of placing yourself in the middle of that situation, because it can be emotionally and mentally draining. You're trying to go on a trip, you're trying to learn as much as you can, you're trying to enjoy this experience, and it's not as enjoyable when you're faced with that microaggression or when you're faced with that bout of racism.
Um, and you already kind of touched on this,
Yeah.
but um, we got a question that basically was like, did you feel safe while traveling and maybe having some experiences? Like, would you recommend that other students go abroad if they, even if they might face new experiences like this? There's that whole expression of the devil you know versus the one you don't, for a lack of a better term. So, what would you say to students who, like this one, might be a bit nervous about going abroad or experiences like this?
Yeah, I think it's definitely about having your support group. In no way I would not stop I would not stop traveling just because of the experience that I had. Um, and I know you don't necessarily know what to do in these sort of situations that because I definitely didn't. It's not something that when you're packing or when you're in these pre-departure meetings you think about. So you're just so excited to be spending your semester. So it can be very shocking. So I think preparing yourself for that and knowing, okay, I am going to be feeling a little bit out of place, more out of place than other people who may be traveling. Um, and I think in preparing yourself and in creating your support group before you go abroad, it'll be less scary. You'll be able to have these interactions and have these moments, which I hope like someone doesn't experience at all at any capacity. But when and if you do, you know, like, okay, I'm gonna take this moment for myself after this interaction and speak to someone who I know has had the same experience, who knows how to support me. And then from there, just sort of take time to yourself to reflect and to remind yourself of your intention of traveling abroad. I think is very important to realize, okay, this is why I'm here and this is not going to stop me from being here and doing what I came to do.
Knowing everything and all the good and the bad and the average experiences you had while abroad, would you do it again?
1010%.
I always kind of love ending on a positive note. So, can you share with us a couple of your top memories or experiences while abroad?
Yeah, definitely. I guess I'll like go back to some pictures too. Riding in this dune buggy was the funnest experience of my life. It was scary. And we were screaming in the car. There were like all these seats were filled, but it was so much fun. We were like driving over hills and jumping over stuff. It was great. And I think looking back at these pictures from Machu Picchu, so we actually walked to Machu Picchu on like, so there's this train track and one of the options you could, we woke up at 4 a.m. to walk across this train track to get to the town where Machu Picchu was. It took, we walked for 4 or 5 hours straight in the rain. It was such it was the most memorable experience ever. It was so much fun. And I think one interesting and fun experience is, so during the time I was in Peru was the Pan American Games, which is basically like the Olympics for all the Americas. And so I went to one of the games, which was so much fun. It was goalball because that was like, we kind of went towards the end of the Pan American Games. So that was one of the options that were left. And it's this interesting game where you kind of see, so the game is specifically for players who are visually impaired or blind. And so it is sort of like soccer and dodgeball mixed together. And it was just like such a cool experience to see the Pan American Games, like this big, huge event, and experience this new sport that I've never encountered before.
That's really wonderful that you got to experience all this. And we appreciate you opening up about your experiences. We hope that in you sharing your experience, um, we know that you will help other students who may have questions about being a minority abroad with preparing, but also knowing that we here, as you know, our office, the CGE, is here for you, and that there are other students who have gone abroad and who will, you know, continue to travel and explore and have wonderful experiences too.
Yeah, I hope that too. I hope that you guys continue the work of sending everyone who wants to go abroad abroad.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in. Again, if you do have any questions for Mariah or for our office, you can always email us. We'll find a way to get those over to Mariah so she can answer them as well. Um, you know, maybe we'll even have a follow-up with Mariah if we get a few, if you're up for that, which we can talk about later. But thank you so much and take care.
Thank you. You have a good one.